welcome to part 2 of our conversation on sexuality with Conversations with Life. We've got Cedar and me, Xochi, and Keith here. And we got into just some real richness in our last episode and got to our end of time mark. And it was like, whoa, there's still a lot to talk about. Maybe we should do a 2-part on this. And so what we're going to get into today is a little more depth into the sacred sexuality, into some of the alternative sexual experiences and lifestyles. And so we're going to be talking about some things that might have some charge around it. And so just wanting to give a bit of a content advisory there, that there's going to be, obviously sexual discussion here, but also some things that maybe, not the general public is used to or comfortable with, but that many people who are on a consciousness or post-religious path will encounter in that experience.
Yeah, so a couple of concepts I think are helpful on this is this idea of personal energy. What are we? It kind of comes down to the very basic core. And, my experience of that is that I am consciousness knowing itself through an energy experience, which manifested a physical form to create a contrast to itself, and that actually doesn't, a lot of spirituality devalues the physical form. I think it's the most important thing, the way I say it is the body follows the mind follows the body, and maybe the spirit's involved in there too. But like we're physical. We're a physical being having a physical experience. We're also an energy being having an energy experience. And I think we're energy first, or consciousness creates energy to experience itself, and then form follows. Right. Okay. Uh-huh. So that's the basic.
Yeah.
construct.
And I think that's one of the basic, things about Tantra that might deviate from other religious paths is that, there's this broad acceptance of everything as sacred, everything as divine, everything coming from, the one love, the one source, and that one love, that one source divides itself on purpose in order to experience itself and grow and, expand and evolve. So, that's kind of the basic, ground level Tantra. And like we were talking about last time, it gets sexual, especially in Western Neo-Tantra. And I think because those are parts of our being in the more Puritan patriarchal society that we've been in for the last several centuries has denied and shamed those pieces. And
I honestly think it's valuable, and I think some of those old traditions were a little bit stuffed sexually. They saw it as a waste or as a distraction or as a problem. In a Kriya Yoga book I have, they were like, which is funny to have a Kriya Yoga book, so it's kind of oral tradition, but, they say, well, Kriya Yogis have sex once a month with their wife, and I'm like, well, that is not going to happen.
Like, Yogananda's parents once a year.
Yeah. And let's make an appointment. And, to me, that feels like denial that was cultural, that came through as a rule or something that didn't work. Yeah. And, I think it's valid to experience sexuality in a freer, broader place, in this place that we are as humanity. And that means we've got to be very careful because, sexual trauma is our deepest trauma often. And when somebody's raped or when somebody's abused as a child sexually, something in our gut goes, yeah, right? We're like, fuck. Because there is a use and a expression of something that is most essentially us, or it gets at something that is so essentially us, that for someone to take that or to play with it for their own purposes, right? To abuse it for their own purposes is really playing with sacred fire, right? It's abusing a sacred place.
Yeah.
And we just understand that naturally, that there is a sacred to that. We've held that in fear rather than expansion, right? And only in fear rather than expansion. And I think it's made the whole thing out of whack, for years and years. I mean, for history, basically. With some exceptions and places where that's not the case, where that's held a lot more freely.
Yeah, instead of, it being this thing of like, this is so sacred, don't touch it. It's like, this is so sacred. There are like vast consequences for your engagement with it. And so, be in a place of, reverence, of honor, of caution, it not from a sense of fear, but from a sense of respect for what could happen. And it's really interesting to think of another person's essence that, we kind of get a glimpse of in the eyes of like a newborn baby. Like, we're so touched by this deep, innocent, connected being, right? And like holding that while at the same time we're exploring the whole spectrum of what our bodies and our energy is capable of in this experience and in this form is really interesting. It's like, always remember there's a newborn baby there, and when you are connecting with somebody in that erotic sexual space, like somebody's inviting you to be with and maybe even touch that innermost sacred piece.
Yeah, but also from there, there's all sorts of experiences, from primal to play to pain to absolute ridiculous expansion and pleasure. Yeah. Right? That will challenge your ego. I mean, have you ever had a sexual experience that's so good, so beautiful, so wonderful that your ego broke? And you're like, I don't know if I'm a person anymore. Right?
Well, and I've also had the experience of it being so beautiful that like, it didn't quite break my ego, but my ego felt like, okay, in order for me to be able to exist in this level of bliss, I now have to attach to that person and insist that that experience be in my life forever,
That's so valuable, though.
It's beautiful.
Isn't it so valuable?
and so, yeah, there's this whole spectrum of beyond the, missionary style procreative sex that I kind of did for 20 years, that it's fun, it's funny, some of it might even seem gross or disturbing, and deeply healing and sacred. And so how do we step into this whole Pandora's box world with any kind of I don't know, like safety harness or structure to be able to do it in a way that is playful and exciting, but we do less harm than what we've seen in our culture so far.
Yeah, I think the first principle there, or the first thing that comes to mind, is owning your own energy. I read an article by somebody who writes on sacred sexuality or sexuality generally, and they were like, men, particularly men, if you desire a woman, if you see a beautiful woman and you get aroused, that's not a problem. We feel like a problem. I felt like I'm embarrassed. I feel like a problem. That's all middle school for me, and in most boys,
even like we get taught that a lot of that is our responsibility to hide or to stifle, and it's like, and I think especially now as a counter to what there was before, where it was a woman's job to like dress a certain way to avoid the bestiality of men. And modern men are being taught like, no, you need to own your own energy and your own shit. And if a woman walks by in a revealing outfit and you're turned on, that's great, but you don't need to do anything about it. Like, it's your job to control your impulse, right? Well, and so it's like this shift.
Yeah, it's not just your impulse, it's your energy.
Sure.
when you let your energy attach to that person and your desire becomes their responsibility, even energetically, you're being creepy.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
When you just enjoy a turn on, like honestly, you see a beautiful woman and say, wow, I'm really attracted to that. And just feel your sense open and like, oh, but see, this is the funny thing. This is the Mickey Singer stuff. Like you're not falling in love with them. And their desire, their shape and whatever it inspires you or their energy, whatever it is, whatever that inspires in you is you. You did it. You opened. You know, they didn't go to your energy and go, you know, you're like you saw that. And because you saw some beauty or felt some inspiration in that image, and there's nothing more beautiful than that if you own it. You know, after I read that article, I ended up going to this rave, my first rave, and you know, there might have been substances there and stuff, and lots of beautiful women. And I went with a whole group of my wife and her friends, bunch of beautiful women, you know, and they're dancing, sexy, and it's gorgeous. And I was just kept bringing this back to myself. You know, just letting myself, probably for one of the first times in my life, be inspired by all the beauty around me, not feel threatened.
Oh, I love that word.
Or like I need to act it out. Like it's some privilege that if I get inspired, I need to go like, you know, proposition somebody or whatever.
Colonize it.
Colonize it or whatever.
Act on it in some way.
Act on it in some way.
Yeah.
Just enjoying. I didn't touch a person the whole night. I was not, you know, I was not in that energy. I was just in my own. And just noticing what was beautiful to me. And I was surprised sometimes. I've been surprised in my life what is beautiful to me and what does turn me on. Because when I open myself with that experience and it doesn't mean anything about me and it's not an identity or it's not anything, then there's a whole wide world of turn on out there like we were talking about in the last episode that's just like, yay, I can be here. I can be here in all this beauty. I can be here, all this love. I can feel it as just that's there. And so, you know, it's like, an interesting thing.
A similar experience that maybe people can resonate with and maybe like practice shifting into that kind of experience would be like when you go to an art gallery and you have experiences with certain pieces of art where it's like, whoa, something's happening here. This piece of art is doing something here. But you just get to stand there and enjoy it, right?
Yeah, you're not taking the art home.
Yeah.
Like, you know, like you're not
touching
you don't have
the
to
art.
Own it.
You don't have
yourself,
to, you know,
enjoy the art. Like, you know.
You can do that, and that's an example of like, oh, okay, here's a space where I've probably held my energy a little better in a similar situation, and then you can go into a bar or club or dance or whatever and be in just delight at the art of life that every human body is. Just absolutely glorious, beautiful, fascinating piece of art. And so I just think that's really fun, but a beautiful practice to be like, oh, what does it feel like, you know, to hold my desire, to hold my attraction instead of letting it leak out sideways. And then it somehow becomes the other person's responsibility to meet that. I think that's what we feel when we feel like somebody's being creepy. Is that their energy's coming out to us and hooking into us. Like now they won't be satisfied until they have us.
Or at least something from you.
Yeah.
Like, you know, like you need to respond or you know, acknowledge their energy in order to like get them to have what they want.
Totally. On the other side of this, if we feel desire coming our direction and you know, it's a projection, or if it isn't, we feel desire. Sometimes somebody can be owning their desire, but we can tell that they have desire, and we're like, we want to put up boundaries or barriers or whatever, or you know, and that doesn't even mean we like or don't like them. It just means that we have a program that's in there. Yeah. To meet somebody else's desire or their approach or whatever it is with love,
or request even. Yeah.
Or request. You know, I have been demonized for making a request to somebody. That was like an honest request, and I was so happy to receive it now. And then somebody goes, rah! Like it's like, whoa! But that was their stuff, right? But to meet somebody's request with love, an honest and loving no is one of the most powerful forces in the universe because it gives that person back their desire and says, no, you're not. that's not where we need to be, or that's not where I want to be right now. And then they have to question what they're doing because they're now in a blah, 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 whatever. So on the other side, to practice meeting other people's requests or desires with attunement, with love, is really beautiful, whether we accept or don't accept them. Right.
Whether it's a yes or a no.
Not taking them on as responsibility. Right. And not eschewing them as a encroachment. That's the place of connection in that middle.
And
place.
when we practice that, we're also practicing that within ourselves.
Yeah.
That gives us a little bit more grace and permission to make those requests, to feel our desire without that like, oh my God, am I being creepy thing? When we can attune and feel that grace for other people, it works both ways. It's really, really lovely. And another thing that came through as you were talking about the opening experience and how it's always us that opens, but for some reason, certain things catalyze that. And the amount of self-exploration that's possible when you're willing to like own an opening or a turn on or an attraction and sit with it is so fun. It's like you're finding a key to yourself. Like what was it? What was the story or belief that I was holding, that I was putting love out here? That for some reason this thing dropped that story for me so that I could experience more of love, the love and fullness that I am. And we get to explore that. And I just think it's fun, but it's also a really beautiful way to expand into a greater capacity for your fullness.
Well, and that's what a lot of Tantra container does. And we'll talk about some of the different experiences that people can have in a while, but a good Tantra container create some juiciness between people, and yeses and nos are exchanged, and people understand, and they meet each other in energy, and they, the lesson of it is, this is you, man. This isn't them.
Yeah.
Nothing here is anybody's responsibility, but yours.
Yeah. And you can only ever feel yourself.
Only ever feel yourself. So, I want to talk a little bit about sexual trauma, and then I want to go to consent and talk about consent.
Yeah, and I'd like to also, I don't often suggest a direction.
Yes, that's great.
But one of the things that I found so drives me crazy. Being a dad of 2 little girls, huge fear for me. And actually now really being a dad of, 5 girls. There is still this instinct and this like conditioning, and maybe it's especially for men, maybe it's not, I don't know, but to make their desires someone else's problem, right? And not just, hey, meet me here, but if you don't meet me here, you are less, you are bad, you are awful, right? And so like I'm talking about the blue balls phenomenon and the like what you were talking about in the last episode, Xochi, about like it being a woman's responsibility to satisfy her partner's urges, because that's that whole conversation, that whole relationship dynamic is so it's ick, right? But it's so part of this whole idea, and it's one of the main reasons that consent gets ignored, or that energy gets overridden, and people end up in sexual trauma because of the feeling of either this like shame if you don't, or guilt if you don't, or all those things. So I'd love to sort of talk more about that too, and on the other side of that, like owning it and saying it's not my responsibility to get someone else to get my rocks off, and also as the other person to be like, it's not my responsibility to satisfy the urge of someone else.
Yeah.
Right? I don't owe them sex, whatever. How to stand firm in that knowledge, in that confidence, in that sovereignty, I guess.
Yeah.
Because I'd love to talk more about that, because that's I think part of the conversation that we tend to like, we're talking right now about understanding that your desires are your own and the energy is your own. And then the flip side of that is understanding that no one else's energy is yours, and you are not just allowed to, but invited to and celebrated for keeping that separate when it needs to be separate.
Yeah. And I think one of the pieces that is missing in the conversation at large about stuff like this is that entitlement that you're talking about.
Yeah.
There's it's almost like a product of the traumatized society is a sense of entitlement.
Mm-hmm.
I'm this poor, sad, fat person, and so people should feel sorry for me and have sex with me. I'm entitled to your energy because I had this bad experience, or I'm entitled to your money because I grew up really poor and I don't have what I need,
Yeah.
And not, not that that's never there. I think children are absolutely entitled to their parents' resources, but I think because most of us were underparented, we still feel that, and we don't want to look at it.
There's still that need.
We don't want to look at that entitlement side.
Yeah.
And you're right, that gets really icky and sticky when it comes to sexuality. Is my husband entitled to my body and my sexuality because, he works and pays the mortgage?
Right. Or even if you don't go like that direction, and it's like, if we're in a monogamous relationship, does that mean I owe him something?
Yeah.
Because he can't go elsewhere?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And I'm like, there's still a bathroom and some lotion. He can go elsewhere.
Yeah.
Like, what I mean? Like, I'm a very firm believer in that like everyone is entitled to their limits, their energy, their levels, right? Like you talk about like the frequency of desire, right, being different for men and women. And there's biological stuff of like, there's a reason a lion will bang the whole pride in a day, right? Like there's a genetic change, but that doesn't that doesn't override or discount anything about consent or about desire from the other side. So it's sort of an interesting dynamic that I want to talk about too, of like, okay, what do you do in that situation, and how do you hold that?
Yeah, and I think there's a handful of questions that are helpful when you're in that space of like, is this truth? Is this trauma? I'm experiencing a desire or an attraction. What do I do with this? One of them is just ask yourself, what does it mean about me if I get this or if I don't get this? And sit with both sides of that.
Right.
What will it mean about me if this desire is met in the way that my mind is telling me it needs to be met? What will it mean about me if it doesn't? Mm-hmm. And then what do I feel entitled to? And are there parts of me that feel like I do or don't deserve? Those questions are more important than whether you get the experience,
True.
That your mind is telling you. And I think it's really important to look at that when we encounter an energy that's new and we feel an attraction or a desire from that, we're having an energetic experience that our mind is trying to interpret. And our mind is always going to try to interpret things based on our past experiences. So it's almost like it sets off our mind machine. It's going to immediately run through all the files of past experience and try to get us something a little bit better than what we've had before.
Right.
And that's the image or the fantasy that we're going to be given when we feel desire. If we identify with that fantasy or we project it onto somebody else, we're going to create trouble. Mm-hmm. It's going to fuck us up. It's going to be probably a miserable experience, even if you get the fantasy met.
Yeah. Anyway, something to...
Yeah.
No, and that's all really good. That privilege thing, especially from the answer and challenge of male sexuality is a big impulse.
Yeah.
Feminine sexuality is less noisy, but also, big impulse. The thing about male sexuality is that in marriage, there's often an expectation. And so there's that thing. In immaturity, there's an expectation, like teenage boys will say ridiculous things to teenage girls to get them to
it's bad
to
for
feel
me.
Like they have some kind of expectation.
I could cause trauma if I don't get this taken care of.
My answer to that is I feel like society's come up with all sorts of different answers for that: prostitution, mistresses, etc. I think prostitution should be illegal for those reasons, and
should be legal.
Should be illegal. Should be legal.
Legal. Okay.
Yes,
Sound like you said illegal.
Oh no, should be legal for that reason. I think that there could be an honor exchange there if there's no abuse and if there's conscious holding of that process. Right. Those kinds of things. Myself, I choose polyanarchy kind of relationship style. Because I don't want to give anybody responsibility, and I don't want to be anybody's sexual responsibility, and at the same time, I want deep relationship. So, I follow that. I follow what's deep, what's really drawn, and what feels honoring and to other people and myself, So here we get into the consent piece. Here we get into the consent. Yeah. And consent on a broader scale is the most important thing about human being. I don't care how freaky you are. I don't care what your experience is. I don't care what else you're doing, right? If you want to shoot holes in your hands, or I don't know where that came from, or if you want to cut yourself or do whatever the hell you want to do as an adult, do it with and for yourself first. And then get consent if you involve anybody else. And that includes spiritual teaching. Someone listens to the podcast, I'm assuming they want to know some stuff, right? Someone comes to a class and pays for it. That's a certain kind of a consent. If I'm just with a friend and I start telling them what they should do, I shouldn't do that. That's not. I should say, hey, how often do you hear this where someone will just start talking to you and they'll know exactly what you should do, right? And they're running off their own consent, their own assumptions or their own trauma, and they're not really.
Well, and often that happens right immediately after you share something vulnerable, where it's like, oh, I was trying to share my experience of feeling, insecure or in grief or whatever. And the other person comes in with their thing, and it's funny because both of those, a little bit of consent conversation, we'll flip that. So I have something really vulnerable to share. Are you available to hold space for it? Yeah. That will help prevent the, hey, this is what I'm doing and this is what I need. Because when you share something vulnerable, you're also putting the other person in a position of power that may or may not be resourced for in the moment.
Right. I mean, if I have a student that's coming to talk to me about something really intense or significant, it's happened a few times where I've had to be like, pause, I'm not the person you should talk to about this. And I've had to sort of say to them, and it's hard to do, and I had to be like, okay, let's go and talk to the person who actually does consent to learn these things about you and to deal with these things with you. And it's when you're being vulnerable, asking for consent in that way is saying to that person, are you open and willing to accept the burden I'm giving you with this vulnerability? Because it can be, right? Like, if you're not someone who's ready or willing or able to hear a certain thing about somebody or whatever, or deal with that, or, that's important to have that consent for as well. But I think consent for yourself. So Steve, you're talking about like when you involve somebody else, right? But I think there is consent in the individual. And that's why like we have all these things where mine is can't drink or do drugs or, even like cutting themselves and all that kind of stuff. Because consent is, it's the informed consent, right? And so we talk about consent as it's the approval with understanding, right? Like if I say to you, hey, I want to fool around a little, and then you say yes. If that's going to go further than that, that previous consent doesn't exist anymore because they weren't informed of this further than that we're going to go, right? And so like a child not knowing the harm that porn will do, for example, right, cannot consent themselves into being an adult at 18 and over and legally downloading porn, right? Like, because there isn't the informed, there isn't the responsibility understanding that's required for consent. And so, when you're talking about like, consenting to putting holes in your hand, right? If you're like, this seems like fun and you have no idea it's going to hurt, you should not be allowed to put holes in your hand. right? Like until you know the repercussions.
So there's some room for messiness here. We don't always know.
Not everything, sure, but like the informed is like the understanding that things exist.
A big part of consent is owning regret. Mm-hmm. So let's say that I ask somebody and I say, hey, can I punch you in the face? And they're like, that seems like a good idea, right? And so I punch him in the face, and they go, well, that hurt way more than I thought. But
you're much stronger than I thought you were going to be.
But that's not your fault, right? That's my fault because I consented to that, right?
Mm-hmm.
It seemed like an interesting experience. I now regret that. I own that. Part of it, that's responsibility on both sides of the
exactly,
thing.
yeah.
And, I think we should give children as much responsibility as they can handle.
Yeah.
And I think the artificial lines we've drawn at ages or whatever might be helpful guidelines. I don't know. But I think that there's a little leeway in here for immaturity to fuck itself up a little bit so it can learn.
Yeah.
But not so much that creates a big danger, So, I lean on that side of growth, but also, I'm a parent. I want my kids to be safe. I don't want them to be engaged there. So, when it comes to sex, children and animals cannot give consent. They just don't have the ability. They don't know themselves enough. They don't understand the ramifications, the total. But here's the freaky thing. None of us do.
Right.
None of us really know what's happening here. So we're always in the mystery a little bit in this game, and we should respect that, right? And because of that mystery, I'm willing to give most people grace, when they encroach. The kid who's driving down the road and he has his bass speakers in the back of his car and he's shaking, every car for a mile with his bass. Is that consent? Is he pushing into my consent? Absolutely. Is he doing it on purpose? Abso-fucking-lutely.
Yeah,
that kid wants me to be going, oh, turn that down, you asshole.
Or to be like super impressed by his dope ass sound system. Right? Like he wants something out of you.
His hearing loss in the next couple of years. But like, it's an interesting game. There's some kind of enjoyment there that person's getting from that I can respect, right? And while I don't really love that experience personally, being next to a car that's basing it up, I'm not going to attack him.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not going to ask for laws to be made. You know what I mean?
Yeah,
so there's a line there where that we push into each other naturally. We're just going to. We're in any conversation, right? I might be going on. You guys may be going like, Steve, like, easy, man. Like,
I mean, that's what society is, right? Like society is the intentional encroachment upon other people, right?
Yeah.
Like we sacrifice our freedom for our safety all the time, and we like. That's, you want to go like John Locke, like that's the whole thing, right? Like that's why we're here. Mm-hmm. And I think the consent being the understanding and acceptance and willingness to accept some regret.
Yes.
Is the big part where you separate children from adults.
Yes.
Right? Because like children developmentally don't see outside themselves. You know what I mean? Like you see it in teenagers all the time. Not like the effect their action has on anyone further than a 1 degree from themselves doesn't even entertain their mind. Right. Doesn't come into play. And so it's like once you can understand regret, consent, and like that relationship, that's I think when we start talking about it. And whatever that age is, and the fact that like the age is different everywhere. Mm-hmm. Like alcohol, for example, 21 in the States, 18 in Australia, 16 in Malta and parts of Europe, like. Nobody fucking knows when it's a good time.
It's the same thing with sexuality.
Exactly.
Like you can get married pretty young in many states still in the United States.
Yeah, which how much I agree on that is
where do you draw the line? And I think in this sense, the informed part, the educational part is highly important, so that people have as much of an idea of what they're signing up for as possible, with the understanding that they don't know.
Yeah.
And that could be, I've eaten lasagna 500 times in my life and I've always liked it. So there's a good chance that next time I eat lasagna, I will like it, but I might not.
Sure.
Mm-hmm.
And that's the same thing with anything that you're going to try in the realm of sexual expansion, that anything that you've said yes to or enjoyed in the past, you're not signed up for that for life. And I think that's another mistake we make in partnership. We have this idea that we really want to know the person, but the way that we interpret knowing is like we make almost an image of them, like, and then they have to always like their coffee the same way.
Right.
Because somehow now it means
weird.
something about how loving I am if I make your coffee right. Instead of knowing somebody, meaning that person gets to die and be reborn every single day, and everything, as much as they want about them can change every day. And I'm here to, to witness and engage with that.
So, let's talk about the practical. Let's get back down to the sexual and say I'm just going to posit the statement that to be sexually free, you have to exist in an internal culture of consent and an external culture of consent, right? You have to create consent in you and around you.
Sure. Be open.
To be sexually free. And I mean this, when I say free, I don't mean you can have sex with anybody you want. I mean that your sexual energies are free to open as you wish they will in your life, be it in a monogamous relationship, a single relationship, a single situation, a polyamorous, whatever openness type of situation, but to be free to feel and to exist in a place where your energy feels safe to move, in a consistent and lovely way. Yeah. And so how do you get consent? It's an interesting question. We talk a lot about this, and we create a lot of this in container. And I think it's just about taking that time almost, and how you do it is not even as important as that you always have that in mind.
Yeah, and that's with yourself and with others, and I think what we want, to me, what freedom really is responsibility, in the sense of responsibility. Like, I am capable of responding to a situation instead of reacting to it. I am capable of choosing what I do instead of letting just the situation or the energy take over me and in this reactive place. And I think that's the kind of freedom that most people are looking for. So responsibility being, I'm going to pause before I do something new, before I engage with someone new, before I take action into this next moment, I'm going to pause and have a consent conversation with myself, with the other person. And I think one of the biggest things to measure in consent, particularly with yourself, is, where are my resources? Am I actually resourced enough for this experience? And resources could be time, money, attention, emotional bandwidth. Have I had enough sleep?
It's huge to measure your resources. How much could I give? I experienced myself as a sexual person. I could have sex with a lot of people. I generally don't, but I could have, sex with a bunch of partners, and that would be fine with me. I wouldn't feel taxed. I wouldn't feel drawn. I would feel good. That'd be lovely. If each of those was an honoring, consensual relationship that met me in energy, that just doesn't happen that much. So whatever. But I could be that way. Other people, they want to hold that fire close, and they want to keep it within a bound, and it's really honoring for them to do that. They would feel totally drawn or pushed or created, emotionally spent, in that experience. Yeah. And that wouldn't be what they wanted to do, And so there's neither of those states is a right or higher way of being, but I think some people want to be higher in what they are, Oh, I'm so careful. I'm so not careful. I like to be expressed. I like to be careful. Like,
well, yeah. And I took
camps is like, oh, I'm right. You're not, you're measuring the resources and as you like to spend them. You know?
I felt somehow like I was more worthy, or valid or whatever if I was available. The more available I am,
the better. Yeah.
The better, right? And I've had to really learn, like,
It's not always
I
true.
gotta pay attention to my resources.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
You know, is that gonna feel like juicy and honoring for me to say yes to that? Even though my impulse is to say yes to as much as possible.
Yeah. Which I think is an honoring impulse if
it comes from a place of truth. If it comes from a place of trauma of like, it's your job as the woman to say yes because your man's got blue balls, like that's not a place of truth, right? Like, whereas if you're like, I love and respect and want to, you know, embrace and experience this with this person as often as it's available, then that's a whole different thing. So I think it comes back to that truth or trauma, like look at your resources.
Something about my worth.
Yeah.
And am I giving more than I have because it means something about my worth or my security or whatever, versus what am I actually available for? And so that phraseology is really helpful, and I'm sure I've brought it up before.
Yeah,
but
absolutely.
Just saying, am I available? Are you available? Am I available? It's different than can you or will you. It has a different, like, less of a charge to it, and it really, like, when I ask somebody, "Are you available?" I'm honoring their resources just by saying that.
Yeah.
Because I'm saying, I would like you to sit with a moment with your resource and see if you're available for this.
Right.
And so I really love that phraseology just as a really practical for any kind of engagement with somebody that, having a serious conversation.
And everyone is new. Like this, when you talk about like engaging with someone new, we talk about it's everyone's right to die and be reborn every single day, right? And so like every time you engage with someone, you're engaging with essentially a new person.
Yeah.
And so you can't take for granted that yesterday you were fine with it, so today you're fine with it, right? Like that availability again is just like it's honoring the fact that they could be a different person today, and that's great, and it's totally fine.
Yeah.
Consent is really important in a monogamous relationship.
Yeah.
It's really important because it's often taken for granted at some point, right?
Absolutely.
I felt taken for granted in my relationship. I was in the opposite experience of most men, where I was in a relationship with a person who had a much higher sex drive than me, right? Which is saying something. And, and it was like sometimes that was, I think, used in different ways or unconsciously created, but that was just a really interesting thing. And sometimes my resources were like, I just want to, whatever. But like, that I wouldn't measure my resources. So it's really interesting. Okay. So consent is a thing that you do that slows down a flow so that you can have unlimited flow on the other side.
Yeah.
Well, a lot of what people don't do consent for is because I just want to be in the moment. I was just with the person, but really in your head, you're having this experience, and that person might be having they might be completely dissociated and like going with you because, going along with it because they don't know. I've been in that experience, not knowing, this person's absolutely dissociated rather than being in a consensual place. And then rather than checking for consent, I'm just in the experience with the person. Right. Right. And then you're like, why didn't they like that? Yeah, because in my head this was really beautiful and romantic and lovely but I assume because I want to assume and hear what's going on, and I fall in love with this story here, and then I project that onto this person, and that creates the problem.
See, I have the opposite problem.
Yeah.
Right. If I'm not explicit, and in getting consent or whatever, right? Then the rest of the time I'm sitting there like, is she okay with this? Is this okay? Is this okay? I just changed position or flow. Right? I'm like, is that all right? And they forget. And now okay, I'm completely fucked up. Yeah. And so like consent is sexy, not because society has used that catchphrase now, but because once you have it, everything else is much more free.
Flow.
You get to be in it.
Yeah.
So we talk about containers. And once you define the experience, as Xochi's like to say, I'm teaching her stuff now. Once you define the experience, you can fully let yourself loose into that experience. So, you sit down with somebody in a Tantra experience and you say, okay, what are we going to do? This is my desire. This is my boundary. This is all the things that I want to communicate. And then once everybody knows that, you just forget get all that stuff, you know what the thing is, and you know what will be violating, won't be,
and you know what, a big part of that conversation is safe words. So I know if I hear a red or yellow or green or whatever the words are that we've come up with,
pineapple,
that we get to pause and
Sasquatch, that's a good one.
It's so beautiful, like that. The amount of big, playful, juicy energy that can show up when you have that. So the consent conversation I teach, I learned from ISTA. They call it RBDSM, and it's relationships, boundaries, desires, sexual health and history, and meaning. And it's so funny because my number one question when I teach this is, but doesn't that ruin the mood? Doesn't that ruin the flow to stop? And I'm just like, if that's the story that you want to have around it, sure. And do you really want to engage that way with somebody that's not willing to stop and have a conversation with you? I promise you'll be able to find the vibe again. Yeah. And in fact, the conversation in itself is very beautiful and intimate. So the other, feedback I get is, I used to have these little business cards that I'd give to all my clients and everybody that I taught. Like, remember to use this conversation before you have sex with someone. And I'd have guys come back and be like, she just started bawling. Nobody had ever asked her these questions before. Yeah.
I mean, that, like, it's so, like, it's like the guy who was weeping with you.
Yeah.
Like, it's so present. It's so, like, honoring to be like, hey, before we do this thing, that let's not, like, dick around and pretend there's nothing. Like, it's a big energy. It's a big field. Let's actually honor that and have a conversation about, like, that's really cool. Like, I'm just like, shameless plug for consent. Like, that's great. Like, you know what I mean? And it's only going to be helpful.
Yes. And the feminine thrives in the container of safety. Flow happens. Yeah. And our own feminine, right, which is our energy moving through us. And it thrives in the container of safety. If I know I can protect myself, I'm not walking down the street shrinking, right? Yeah. If I know that I know what the parameters are and I know what violates them, even if they're violated, I'm safe, you see? Because I can push back. I know what a violation is and I can push back on it and say no, right? We want to protect ourselves. Yeah. But more than protection, we want love and connection. And those two fight each other all the time. So when you create container safety with this discussion, it really works.
You get both, yeah.
Honestly, meaning is my favorite part of that discussion because boundaries are pretty obvious. Like, don't do this, do this, right? Like this is the parameters that we're working with here, right?
Desire is pretty
don't
obvious.
Bite my
what
nipples.
Do you want?
I got it, right? I'm going to get hit on the head by my nipples. Don't ask me how I know that. But,
the plural gets me. I'm like, what the fuck are you doing? Like,
it works with some partners.
Sure.
So, but but the meaning thing is really fascinating because I want to know that more than anything. Yeah. I want to know that more than anything because if somebody says if they want to have sex with me or they want to engage sexually with me, that now they own a piece of me, I have nothing to do with that. You don't. Yeah. This is not real estate that you own or that you can claim, right? And even if I get that vibe, it's like, well, okay, well maybe we ought to just have a cuddle. That's great. It's all that is wonderful. By the way, another thing that it does is it sets you up to say that every experience, however we engage with any human being, is valuable.
Yes.
Yeah. There isn't more value on a full sexual expression. That's its own experience in its own way, and it has value in itself, right? Don't get me wrong. It's beautiful, and we all want that. But a sit and look in the eyes, a hand hold, a cuddle, a hug.
A great conversation.
A great conversation. I put my hand on your heart. All of these are really, really, really juicy containers. And they're very meaningful to me.
Oh yeah.
And I want to express that, right? And sometimes in the meaning conversations, well, I don't want to engage with you because that means too much. I can kind of get that vibe. Usually not expressed that way, but I'm like, oh, that's really lovely for me when that happens, because their level of intimacy resources are low, right? So meaning lets us gauge our intimacy resources.
Yeah.
And our expectations, and it's like, okay, if I have sex with you, then I want you to call me every day from here on out.
Yeah.
You know, like there's a new relationship
thing.
level happening. And that's an important thing to know.
Yeah, I think getting into this, we're talking about the nitty-gritty now of like actually expression, and like this would be a great time, I think, to talk about what are some of the things that people are going to be exposed to, people are going to experience, like our BDSM?
Yeah, so our BDSM is a play on BDSM,
right.
which is a field of sexual exploration, and just to make a handy acronym for the consent conversation. But yeah, so that's something that you would want to do before you engage in any sexual activity. But BDSM is one of the things that you might come across in your experience of sexual exploration.
And we've talked about this before. We've talked about when you break out of your constructed ideas, you often go to crazy extremes to find the outside of your boundary. I'm not saying that, you know, these things are crazy extremes, but I think it's not even a cautionary tale. It's a thing to be aware of, that if you are on this kind of journey, you may find yourself in places you weren't even ever expecting when you started.
Yeah.
And so, like, this is an informative moment to be like, hey, here you go.
It is. You know, you do end up in places. I've been in situations where I'm like, oh my shit. 10 years ago, Steve would be like, what in the fuck are you doing, man? How did you get here? You know? BDSM, by the way, is a really interesting encounter, and I've encountered it in a limited way, but have. And one thing I like when I meet somebody or engage with somebody who's done BDSM, you know, bondage, sadomasochism, you know, I can't remember even what they all stand for, right? But this is pain for pleasure. This is playing with pain in a pleasure context. And is that they know how to negotiate. They become very good communicators, because someone's going to beat you with a stick.
Yeah, you need to know
or whip
what the
you
safe
with
word is.
a flogger, or, you know, whatever other kind of pain experience you're going to experience. You're pretty careful. You know?
Yeah, it's very taxing on our physical resources, which makes it really clear, like, both for the dom and the sub. So if you're standing there flogging somebody, if there's no time limit and you just signed yourself up to flog them into senselessness, and then they're in this sensitive space and all of a sudden your arm's tired,
right?
That's a big emotional drop for them, for you to just stop. So it's stuff like that that it's so beautiful, because it creates this opportunity for conversation and clarity around our resources
and consciousness. You know, there's a real conscious, there's a conscious BDSM. There is an unconscious BDSM, where instead of getting into a renegotiating of pain, right, which often helps people in that community work with trauma, it's really good for that. It gets them into a loop where they reenact. So Peter Levine talks about this, reenactment versus renegotiation. Renegotiation is, I'm encountering a pain experience or something that was like something I experienced that was dishonoring, that crossed my boundaries, that dishonored me, that made created trauma. And then I'm recreating that in a way that I'm renegotiating that. So now I have power over pain, right?
Yeah.
Now I'm engaging with it consciously, and that breaks the loop. And now you're good. But what happens in BDSM, I've seen a bunch of times, is that people get into a loop. So they were in a power dynamic and they wanted to renegotiate that. But now they
identify with it in a way that they just stay in the
loop.
Trauma.
So now they're reenacting their trauma over and over and over again. And that feels good until you're totally worn out. And you realize you're not doing it. So reenactment versus renegotiation is probably, you know, in the sexual field generally is pretty important, right? One of the things that big energy and ecstatic experience does is it gives us a chance to renegotiate, because it opens up our energy, and now we're in a place where we can feel loved. You can heal a sexual relationship that was broken with a sexual relationship that is whole.
Yeah.
You know, engaging in some of the same ways, but now there's real love there, and there's real connection there,
and safety and honor,
and honor. And now your sexual self goes, oh, I can be here. My energy, my life force energy, just in my life, can wake up in those experiences. Now I'm honored. You know, So,
Yeah, and I think if you're wondering, like, am I renegotiating or am I reenacting? Reenactment has like kind of this similar feeling of it, like an addictive nature, where it's like, I need it. Okay, I'm going to reenact this thing. And during the reenactment, you might have a hit of life force open up because your system's used to that level of drama and trauma. But as soon as it's over, you're down again. Yeah. Whereas a renegotiation, you're actually going to feel like you grew, like you're more empowered. Your life force energy is moving more freely, and you're holding yourself better.
Well, and I think some of these sexual containers and experiences will kick you out. And that's a good place to bring up swinging, because one of the things that a lot of people do when they're in an awakening and there's no more rules and they've left religion, or they're just, they're feeling energy go and they're feeling their life force energy and they were like, I'll express it, but I'm married and I have this thing. They go out and they're like, oh, there's other people who want to experience that, stay in their relationship, in their marriage, in their partnership, but then, have sexual experience with others. And it's beautiful. It's lovely. And absolutely problematic, because in that community of people who call them swingers, my experience is that the boundary thing is often misunderstood. And on purpose. These people want to have a wild sexual experience, so they don't want to set boundaries real carefully, or they don't know their resources and they don't understand their relationship. Usually one person in the couple is like, I want to go do this, honey. And the other one's like, okay, since you want to. You know?
Sort of more guilted into it.
More guilted into it.
Yeah.
And then there's already this power dynamic going on, and this person's doing this and this person's watching. It can create some real interesting messiness.
Well, yeah, and I think the other thing to be aware of with that is that connection is almost boundaried out of that that field. So like connection, like emotional connection, relationship type connection. They call it catching feelings. Like you can have whatever sexual experience you want with other people, but you can't catch feelings.
It limits the sexual experience in a way that, like I said, if you're just having biological sex and your animal just wants to go there and do that, you'll get to the point you're like, this sucks. Yeah.
Well, yeah, or you'll be like, okay, I really like this, and so we can't always control if we catch feelings. That's the other thing that I don't think people really want to look at in that community is, okay, I caught feelings. Well, now what? Because we didn't set up any kind of like, what if this happens? We're just like, don't do it. But that's not necessarily something you can control. And so I think that those are some things to kind of just like suss through if you're thinking about going into swinging. I happen to have really sacred, beautiful, powerful connections my whole life sexually with, my monogamous marriage. It was a beautiful experience. And, since I opened up in that experience, I've only ever in my life, even as a sex worker, had 2 times where I felt disconnected in a sexual experience. And both of the times it was people who were heavily into the swinging community. And it was actually a conversation with you where because you had been there and I hadn't, where you're like, oh yeah, well that's on purpose. Like they're trying not to be connected. Yeah. And I was like, oh, okay, that's so not for me.
What it is.
And that kicked me out too, right? Part of that was I had 2 experiences where the woman texted me after the experience and it was like, I just wanted sex and now I feel something. And that's a lot. And I'm like, okay. Great. Too bad, because it was beautiful. I was like, I could have this connection with you. One of the things is that connection is not limited by time and space. And this gets us into poly, where I can have an experience with somebody that's super, super meaningful and beautiful and wonderful, and it's a one-time experience.
Absolutely.
And I can close that container and I can move on.
And that's a successful relationship.
That's a successful relationship. I can have a lifelong experience with a life mate, right? And that becomes just the thing. And that's a successful relationship. Now, people are like, maybe you're listening to this, or maybe you're Keith over here, and you're saying, I don't see it. I don't get it. That doesn't make sense to me. Well, it's because that's not true for you. Totally okay. Yeah. And at the same time, that's what I experience, that's what that meaning component in that discussion is so important, because if I can get in it, I can be emotionally connected. Man, Ram Dass talks about this. He talks about how on the spiritual path he falls in love with everybody.
Yeah.
That one over there. I can't remember. Jack Cornfield was talking about this. He's talking about falling in love with everybody, and he sees this beautiful, very large black woman, and he looks at his current partner. He goes, and she's like, that one's, oh my gosh, right? Because her soul was just shiny, and he's like, oh, I just love her. That doesn't mean he's going to do anything.
Yeah.
But you fall in love with anybody. It's a bit confusing, Ram Dass fell in love with his guru. You're supposed to fall in love with a guru, and then like what that is and how that is becomes like, it's like the soul's like, wait a minute, what do I need to do here? Nothing.
Yeah.
Not a damn thing. Love has no conditions. Real love, true love, it's love. It has no conditions. Conditional love isn't love, right?
That's powerful.
It's powerful, and that's what you learn. They say fuck around and find out, and if you do, you'll eventually learn that, right? That you can be in love, with the people that you're with. You'll also learn that not everybody can meet you in that place, and that operating outside of that place of love is not good. Not good for a human ever. Right. This is why I really respect monogamy, and I honor it as a valid path. I really respect poly, or I honor it as a valid path. I really respect swinging BDSM. I feel like, just my opinion, that those will both kick you out eventually. That they have a process to them. That there's an interesting container there. That eventually you'll go, well, I really want to be connected. I really want this. Yeah. I want love. I don't want just sex, because you do. And then you get that out, and then you
have your fill, and then you're like, now I still feel empty and whatever.
Yeah, I still feel I'm still empty and meaningless, and I don't feel really connected, and I feel maybe even worse than I did before.
Yeah, and I think there's a shift from what are all the sensations and experiences I haven't had because I've been sexually repressed, and please go through that process and play with it and be immature and consent, please. Keep your agreements, please. It's so much less messy if you keep your agreements and get consent. And beyond that, just play and have fun and be immature. And what you'll find is that like a lot of that stuff will get satiated pretty quickly. And then it won't be so much about, okay, what's my next sensational experience? It's about, now I'm so alive and full and turned on all the time. Like, where do I get to share and express this?
There's a couple things here I need to mention that are interesting, and that is every couple that I knew that was my Mormon friends are now divorced. Every single one. Maybe there's one left.
Are you talking about that you knew in the church, or that were church. Okay?
And as they hit their awakening, it's hard on relationship. So the sexual awakening as part of the overall awakening can be really rough, and it will be expressed that way. It's rough anyway, even if there isn't any, whatever, openness or even infidelity or whatever else that happens. It's hard anyway. The awakening experience is hard on relationship.
Yeah.
It will open you to parts of you that you haven't seen, repressed things that you have to now look at, and it will shift your energy in a way, and you won't always shift together. If you can, my ex-wife and I managed it for 6 years. We really worked together, and then at some point we just knew that was going to go, right?
Yeah.
And I knew, actually. I knew. I had a big breakdown over it. And then that eventually ended up being true, unfortunately, and fortunately at the same time.
It's like an ego death to your relationship. No matter what, your relationship has to be renegotiated. Even if you stay monogamous, your relationship has to be renegotiated because you and your partner are going to become new people.
Yeah.
That's going to happen. The other thing I will say is that your awakening has to go through your sexuality.
Yeah.
Your sexuality, there's not an option here. Your sexuality is a part of your basic life force energy, and your sexuality is part of that or I don't trust that awakening.
Yeah, it's good. It's an
Sure.
encounter that has to be met.
It
I mean,
has an encounter to
if what you guys have been talking about and sexuality being that it is as like you, as part of you as breathing and drinking water, then you can't wake up while part of you sleeps.
You can't hold them
You know what I
separately.
mean? That's not a thing.
Yes.
Right? I can't be half awake. I'm either going to wake up or I'm not. I'm either going to have an awakening or I'm not. And so every part of me is being awakened at the same time. And that's what we've talked about my experience going through this and had to experience that too myself. And like my sex drive and my sexuality and all the things had to be by necessity a part of this conversation because as I was awakening in other areas, those parts of me were awakening regardless of intention.
Yeah.
It just happens. So
Yeah. And here's another thing. The path is beautiful. When we allow all of these to be part of us and all part of the thing, sex is actually, I think, one of the most meaningful experiences. Your own relationship with your sexuality is one of the most meaningful places you can be. It is the left-hand path, though. It will burn everything out, quickly, and it will make you go, what? And it will shake you. And that's okay. That's what it's about. Like we want that to happen. He who has not been consumed in the inferno of his passions
hasn't
not
lived.
really lived.
Yeah.
And, you can see that statement from this other side where, you want to overcome things. Really? Really what you want to do is engage and be alive and feel alive and integrate them. So it's really fascinating.
Yeah.
Thanks for joining us today. We hope you enjoyed this conversation. We would love to hear your questions and comments. Today's topic in particular was quite sensitive and interesting and expansive. So please reach out to us if you have any further questions or if you want some assistance along your awakening path with your relationships, with your sexuality. You can find us at www.soulandspiritwellness.com. Please like, share, and subscribe so that we can get more listeners in on our conversation.